Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into three powerful uprisings that shook America, not because they were chaotic, but because they were calculated responses to deep, systemic betrayal. Now let's start with a simple but uncomfortable question. What if rebellion isn't disorder, but a signal that the system itself is broken? From the swamps of colonial Virginia to the whiskey stills of frontier Pennsylvania, and finally to the dusty makeshift camps of desperate veterans outside Washington, D.C., ordinary people have risen up against elites who promised justice but delivered control. Rebellions are often portrayed as dangerous, irrational bursts of mob energy. But when you look closer, you begin to see something more revealing. These were cries from the ground up. They weren't just about taxes or land. They were about dignity, survival, and the growing sense that those in power were no longer acting in the interest of the people they claimed to represent. We're going to explore three of these moments: Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, the Whiskey Rebellion in the 1790s, and the Bonus Army protest in 1932. On the surface, they may seem like isolated incidents, but look deeper, and you'll find a common thread: grassroots movements, led by the working class, clashing with elite institutions that were more interested in preserving their own power than responding to the needs of everyday people. So this isn't just a history lesson, it's an investigation into the pattern, one that still echoes in our world today. Let's begin our journey with Bacon's Rebellion, a volatile mix of land hunger, political exclusion, and the seeds of racial division planted by fear. Let's go back to colonial Virginia, 1676, a time when the American experiment was still simmering in the pot, and the heat was rising fast. This was a rebellion not just of guns and fire, but of frustrated hopes and broken promises. Nathaniel Bacon, a young, ambitious member of the colonial elite, found himself aligning with the very people society tried to keep at the bottom: indentured servants, poor frontier farmers, and disenfranchised settlers. Why? Because both groups shared a common enemy: Governor William Barclay, the man at the top. Barclay, like many in power, had grown comfortable. He prioritized wealthy planters, protected lucrative trade agreements, and refused to take action against native tribes that settlers accused of attacking their outposts. The frontier population, though scraping by on the edge of English control, were left vulnerable, ignored, and angry. Bacon became their voice, and soon, their weapon. They weren't just demanding military protection. They were demanding a seat at the table, land, representation, recognition. But to the colonial elite, this uprising was dangerous not because of its violence, but because of its unity. It blurred the lines between class and, for a moment, even race. And that terrified them. After the rebellion was crushed, the elite didn't just punish the rebels. They rewrote the social contract. They shifted away from indentured servitude, which could breed solidarity between poor whites and black laborers, and turned decisively toward African slavery. Why? Because they believed slaves, stripped of rights and generationally bound, were easier to control, more permanent, less risky. This wasn't just a crackdown. It was a pivot. The plantation class learned that class solidarity among the lower orders was the greatest threat to their grip on power. So they divided them, by law, by skin color, by fear, and in doing so, they built a new kind of hierarchy, one that would shape American labor and race relations for centuries. Bacon's rebellion didn't just end with ashes, it ended with a blueprint for control. Now fast forward a little over a century. The colonies have become a republic. The Constitution is fresh ink. George Washington is president. And yet, rebellion brews once again. The Whiskey Rebellion wasn't just about liquor, it was about liberty. When Alexander Hamilton, the architect of America's financial system, pushed for a federal excise tax on whiskey in 1791, he saw it as a way to raise revenue and establish federal credit. But for small farmers and distillers in western Pennsylvania, this tax felt like a slap in the face. These were people living on the edge of the nation, geographically, economically, and politically. For them, whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was currency, a lifeline, a product they could produce and trade when hard cash was scarce. And now, the federal government, hundreds of miles away, wanted a cut. To them, this wasn't taxation with representation. It was taxation with condescension. They resisted, and the resistance spread. Tax collectors were threatened, tarred, and chased out of town. Some federal officials were even forced to flee. But instead of compromise, The response was force. President Washington, urged by Hamilton, led over 12,000 troops, more than he had ever commanded during the Revolutionary War, into Pennsylvania to crush the rebellion. It marked the first time the new federal government used military power against its own citizens. Now pause for a moment and consider that the very same leaders who had fought a war over British taxes and imperial overreach were now sending soldiers against American citizens for resisting attacks. The rebellion fizzled out without a large battle, but the message was clear: the government would enforce its will, even at gunpoint. And the deeper issue remained: rural communities felt abandoned and exploited by a central government more concerned with national finance than local hardship. This clash between fiscal control and agrarian independence laid bare a core tension in the young republic. Would it serve its citizens, or manage them? The Whiskey Rebellion may not have succeeded, but it set a lasting precedent, one where economic policy would be shaped at the top and enforced from the top down. Now we jump forward to the Great Depression, 1932. The economy is in ruins. Unemployment has reached catastrophic levels, and into this national despair steps a group of veterans, not with rifles, not with violence, but with tents, signs, and desperate hope. They called themselves the Bonus Army. Over 40,000 people, many of them World War I veterans and their families, marched on Washington, D.C., and set up camp. Their demand was simple: pay out the bonuses they had been promised for their wartime service, early, not in 1945, as scheduled, but now, when they needed it most. They weren't asking for charity, they were asking for what was already owed. But to the federal government, this peaceful protest was seen not as a plea for justice, but as a threat to order. President Herbert Hoover responded with stunning violence. He called in the military. General Douglas MacArthur, yes, that MacArthur, led troops, tanks, and cavalry through the camps. They used tear gas, they set fire to tents, they drove unarmed veterans, wives, and children out of their makeshift homes. Let that sink in. The United States government turned its army against its own veterans, men who had once risked their lives under the American flag. The public was horrified. The attack exposed a deeper fear at the heart of the Depression, that organized, economic dissent, especially by those with moral standing like veterans, might ripple outward, might grow, might challenge the system itself. But even in defeat, the Bonus Army left a legacy. Their treatment became a national scandal, and just a few years later, under President Franklin Roosevelt, the GI Bill was born, providing education, housing, and support for returning veterans. A direct policy shift sparked, in part, by the injustice these men had endured. So the Bonus Army didn't win their battle, but they changed the war. They revealed the cracks in the government's foundation, and forced the nation to ask, once again, what do we owe to those who serve? And what happens when we fail them? So why did these rebellions, Bacon's, the Whiskey Rebellion, the Bonus Army, strike such fear into the hearts of those in power? It wasn't just the crowds. It wasn't just the fires or the slogans or the signs. It was what they represented. Each of these uprisings revealed a dangerous possibility that ordinary people could organize, resist, and demand accountability. And if one group could rise up, what's to stop another? The elite didn't fear chaos for its own sake. They feared contagion. Rebellion, like a spark in dry brush, spreads fast when the conditions are right. In each case, those in power responded not with reform or reflection, but with swift, strategic force. Because the real threat wasn't violence, it was legitimacy. When poor whites and black laborers united in Bacon's rebellion, the ruling class saw solidarity across lines they had carefully constructed. When frontier farmers rejected federal taxation, the new American government realized its authority wasn't as secure as the Constitution claimed. And when veterans camped out peacefully in the nation's capital, they brought with them a moral power that cannons couldn't erase. Each moment forced elites to make a choice: accommodate the demands of the many, or entrench the power of the few. And again, the response was to tighten control. We see it in the pivot to racialized slavery after Bacon's rebellion, a deliberate divide-and-conquer tactic. We see it in the militarized response to tax resistance. And we see it in tanks rolling down the streets of Washington to drive out soldiers who had once defended the country abroad. These weren't just reactions. They were warnings to future dissenters, to those watching quietly from the sidelines. The message was simple: challenge the system, and the system will strike back. But here's the twist. The fear that gripped the elite? It was rooted in a truth they didn't want to face: that power without consent is fragile. That policies made in isolation, from palaces, capitals, or marble halls, will eventually collide with reality on the streets, in the fields, and at the gates of government buildings. These rebellions didn't just threaten order, they exposed how thin that order really was. Let's pause and ask the bigger questions, because these uprisings weren't just about immediate grievances. They were windows into deeper moral and economic truths that still echo today. At the heart of each rebellion is a tension between coercion and consent. Do governments rule because they serve the people, or because they can force compliance? Bacon's rebellion showed how quickly a population can erupt when they're excluded from the political process and denied access to land that, to them, represented freedom and opportunity. But when they demanded inclusion, they got suppression. And in response, the system doubled down, not by addressing grievances, but by creating new hierarchies that made unity harder. That's not resolution, that's containment. The Whiskey Rebellion revealed how central policies, even when framed as economic necessities, can create ripple effects that devastate the people furthest from the levers of power. Small-scale distillers didn't see themselves as part of Hamilton's grand fiscal vision. They saw an outsider's hand reaching into their pockets. Their rebellion was crushed, but the distrust it sowed, that lingered. And the bonus army? That was about promises. Commitments made by the state to those who had sacrificed everything. When those promises were broken, and peaceful petitioners were met with violence, it sent a message, not just to veterans, but to every working-class citizen watching. Each of these cases asks us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that centralization, without feedback from the bottom, tends to prioritize stability over justice, order over empathy, enforcement over reform. But rebellion, however messy, however inconvenient, has historically forced innovation. Sometimes it leads to change. Other times it's buried and forgotten, until the pressure builds again. These stories remind us that policy isn't just policy, it's power in action. And when that power forgets the people eventually remind the power who's really in charge. So what are we left with? Not just tales of protest, but a deeper lesson that every system creates its own shadows. And sometimes, those shadows rise up, not to destroy, but to be seen. Let's bring it all together. If these rebellions taught us anything, it's this: systems built from the top down may look stable, until they're not. The more tightly a government tries to grip control, through taxes, force, or exclusion, the more it risks collapse from the very foundation it ignores. Bacon's rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, and the bonus army didn't erupt from nowhere. They were the natural result of leaders forgetting something basic: you can't govern people without listening to them. You can command, coerce, and intimidate, but that's not the same as legitimacy. What makes this all so fragile is that centralized power often assumes its own permanence. But history shows us, again and again, that when enough people feel unheard, unsafe, or unseen, they push back. And when they do, the real strength of a system is revealed, not in how it suppresses dissent, but in how it responds to it. Decentralized systems, by contrast, spread out that tension. They let local voices shape policy. They allow flexibility. They adapt instead of crack. That's not chaos, it's resilience. These rebellions are more than footnotes. They're signals, warnings, case studies in what happens when power overreaches and forgets its purpose. And maybe the most important takeaway? When people fight back, not just with weapons, but with unity, with truth, and with courage, they force the system to reveal what it really is. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. If you found this video thought-provoking, if it made you see the past a little differently, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. There's a lot more to uncover, and we're just getting started. Check out the other videos on the channel for more stories that challenge the official narrative, spotlight untold truths, and explore how the past continues to shape the present. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and keep asking the hard questions.